At this time is back. We're here with a longtime friend, Dan Newbold. We used to work together. Dan, I'm always jealous of you because you went from working at KIP, where you and I were working hard to find and convince people to teach in our schools. Then you went to Netflix, and I imagine you're fending off people throwing resumes at you as you walk in the office, leave the office, get in your car. What is it like working at a place that probably everybody wants to work at?
Is a good question. You're saying everybody didn't want to teach and work at KIP?
No one wants to teach
I
math? What are
know
you talking about?
it's what's interesting is I actually given it. I think about that a lot actually because it's like challenging in a completely different way, if that makes sense. So in terms of it's like it's funny too because I remember like when we went to that recruitment event. Do you remember that? Like the mixer, not recruitment event that was in fact very much a recruiting event. But that was like the first exposure that I had. I remember like going through like 8, 10 interviews later. And I remember talking to eventually person that sort of hired me. And that person was also a former TFA or former teacher and was like, listen, if you can sort of find a, bilingual teacher from Chicago to move to LA to teach it wherever it is, right? Like, we're pretty sure you can recruit and hire anybody. And so I was like, okay, great. Well, if I can do that, we can do it in a completely different challenge, right? And I think every organization you sort of experience different challenges from like a talent acquisition standpoint. But I feel like at KIP, such a major challenge for us was awareness, right? And sort of, a lot of the work that was really fun at the moment, but like the employer branding and recruitment marketing work that we did
How you stand
just
out?
to sort of build that awareness, right? And then you think about sort of the pressure and the ask of teachers or non-instructional staff and sort of the bar that you have for hiring, like the bar is still the same, I think, wherever you are. But the challenge of finding that just right person, I think that's like has been the biggest shift is that, being in Netflix is relatively talent dense and lean org. So like we're big, like we got 13,000 people, but our teams are still really lean, right? So you become very specialized in a particular area. And there's a lot of ownership and sort of agency at the individual level, right? And so the challenge therein is almost like the antithesis. Like I remember at KIP, we would send, if we were doing like passive or outbound recruiting, I remember I think my LinkedIn got shut down because I was sending too many in-mails and not getting any response. And they were like, hey, are you spamming people?
Yes,
You reach
yes,
out
we
to
are. We are.
200 teachers, right? And you might get 2 or 3 responses, like the luxury of being at like a sort of desire. I don't want to say that because it makes it
Very
sound
well
like
known.
desirable,
People
but
will,
like a
yeah.
place that's like well known, right? And I think is a fairly public like culture and that sort of thing is that you use a pretty high response rate. And so the challenge from there is, how do you find the right person and be really intentional with that sort of sourcing strategy and talent sort of acquisition strategy, right? So we don't lean like too heavily on sort of the inbound or the applicants, right? So I think I don't know, for like better and for worse, right? There's thousands and thousands of applicants, but who knows what's going to be in there? And then your time is often better spent being very strategic and intentional, sort of cultivating relationships with folks that you feel like would be really additive down the line. And then eventually sort of placing them in that function, right? And so I don't know, like it's a long-winded way to say that like there still is a very sort of innate challenge, I think, in terms of assessing and evaluating and not just like finding and attracting the talent. I think that's where there was more of like a talent attraction challenge at KIP. And I think like that fortunately is not as much of a challenge at Netflix. The challenge there is a bit more on like the evaluation side and
Uh,
frankly like making sure you hire the best person out
yeah.
of the sea of folks for the role.
Well, I feel like for a long time, Netflix is known for a pretty unique talent strategy, and they had a well-known talent deck that explained their philosophy and approach. Now, with the stacks of resumes being so high, like what is the interview gauntlet like for somebody if they do catch somebody's eye, recruiter-wise, or they make it past round one? Are there 7, 8 more rounds to go? Like, what's the usual process these days for you?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So the culture memo, which 10 years ago was like a deck that was like 100 slides and looked like it's kind of put together in like a middle schooler. It's evolved quite a bit, right? It's a memo now, and it's still really true to form in terms of the principles and the values that are outlined, right? And I think are pretty universal organizationally. And so that is a really key part as we think about hiring, right? And sort of ultimately getting to that offer stage. There's like the core competencies from a skill, from an attribute standpoint, the background and the experience, right? That really need to be aligned with the particular role. those other pieces, though, the principles and the values, are just as important, right? So whether it's candor or curiosity or courage, or judgment, right? These sort of, ethos of freedom and responsibility, or context, not control, right? People over process. Now I'm just like the company man rattling them all off, right? But they're really critical, right, to somebody's success and impact within the organization. So then the challenge is like, when you got a 30-minute phone call or a 30-minute interview or video interview, how do you assess those things? And so that's where sort of the interview loop comes in, right? And so early stages, this is getting like, nitty gritty TA, right? But you're sort of building the evaluation loop with your hiring manager, right? So if we want to hire X candidate for whatever function or level or role it might be, like, what are those competencies? What are the skills? What are the attributes? What's our background, what's the experience, right? And then beyond that, where is there an opportunity for additivity? Is it, lived experience, professional experience? What are those gaps on the team? And like, how do we think about complementary skill sets, and sort of continuing to build? So from there, right, like once you get that outlined and get that alignment with your hiring manager, it comes down to sort of identifying the right folks to evaluate those areas, if that makes sense, right?
So you get to pick and pull in people from different teams.
Exactly, right? So depending on the functional area, right, the goal is to give, like, once somebody goes through the full interview loop, the goal is to give the hiring manager 360-degree evaluation from those cross-functional partners, really directed on those competencies, right? So maybe a core competency is, I don't know, strategic leadership. Maybe it's curiosity. Maybe it's collaboration, right? So, been working recently with like product marketing leads as an example, right? And collaboration is a big piece, right? Because they're then sort of finding that just right nexus between marketing and product. Like, how do you collaborate? How do you influence, farm for dissent? How do you share feedback, right? And so from there, once you got those competencies mapped out, it's about identifying the right cross-functional folks within the organization to then evaluate those areas. So from a hiring manager, if you're the hiring manager, by the time somebody goes all the way through, you've got a pretty comprehensive set of feedback that's also really intentional and designed to sort of evaluate those areas. Conversely, if you're the candidate, by the time ideally you go through the interview loop, you get a pretty good cross section or snapshot as to like who you're actually going to be working with, and you've got an ability to ask questions, right, and get a feel for how this role, how this work would actually show up based on the sort of cross-functional folks that you're meeting with. I keep
And
saying
then,
cross-functional. Sometimes it's sort of within the same team, but I think that sort of value add comes pretty frequently from the external or from the cross-functional folks.
and at those interview stages, are you locked into a bank of questions that have to be asked if it's trying to uncover this about this competency, or how much freedom do people get?
We're not. Some organizations are, like, competitively, at least from my understanding, it can be a little bit more scripted, right? And so we want you to ask these questions and evaluate these areas. We're not as much that way. We want each conversation to be unique and a bit more conversational, a bit more of that dialogue, right? So you can get a feel for the actual individual and human, build that chemistry. And so that's where we come into from a talent acquisition standpoint. Sometimes if you've got a panelist, right, within the interview loop who's tasked with assessing a certain, core competency or skill set, they might not have, it might be new to interviewing or might not have some of those go-to questions. That's where we can come in to sort of partner and think aloud and sort of even do like a bit of that role play, right, between like situational questions or behavioral questions. But it's really up to the individual, right, to sort of structure that interview, typically about 30 minutes or so, in whatever way, they feel like they're going to be best positioned to evaluate.
Are there any performance task components at any different parts of the process?
Depends on the team. Yeah, it depends on the team. And I think it really comes back to, that's what we ask, the hiring manager, right? Like if, there is a performance or like a creative assignment or creative exercise, it always has to be rooted in, and again, sort of the competency or what you're looking to evaluate, right? And so sometimes it's something as simple as sort of written communication. Sometimes it's actual like influence, right? So teams that I work with that are a bit more involved in sales, right? So we're talking about ads as an example. And I hate this term, so forgive me, but that sort of executive presence piece, that ability to deliver a pitch and to influence, that is something that sometimes they'll bake in, right? On the creative side, sometimes they'll sort of fold in a creative assignment where they ask somebody to develop a brief or a pitch, right, around a title, around a show or a film as an example, right? And for those, that typically feeds into that final interview. where not only is the hiring manager sort of evaluating the actual case study, but they're also able to sort of ask questions, right, and have a bit more of that back and forth to see like what was that person's strategic approach? How did they think through it? And then B, how do they sort of engage in a back and forth like that? So culturally, right, like farming for dissent and feedback is really important, and that's a good opportunity to evaluate a bit of their candor, their critical thinking, more like that live walkthrough and sort of feedback session, if you will.
How hard is it to close offers? Does anyone ever say no to you? Do you have much negotiating room at the end? I kind of.
So I partner with the broader marketing, for the most part, marketing team, and I feel like we actually just did a year in review. We're fortunate; it's relatively high. I think last year our acceptance rate across the global marketing was like 96%.
I would imagine.
For folks that, yeah, again, like very fortunate, right? And so I think the reasons folks decline are a handful, right? Sometimes it's logistical and like relocation. And then depending on the org and the function, sometimes it could be compensation if that person has a competing offer or, decides just to not make a move.
Is there a lot of competition between, say, like an Amazon or an Apple TV Plus or those kind of things between people?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. I would say
Are there any
relative,
rules about poaching?
very no rules.
No
I
rules.
quote former CEO and board chairman Reed, no rules, rules. And
No rules.
so I would say, listen, we try to avoid, there have been times, since I've been here where we've gone really heavy, like early days when we were really building and hiring at scale at certain studios or networks, right? And then, either legally or just sort of inherently have backed off a little bit, right? Just from a goodwill perspective. But no, I mean, listen, like if our creative groups are working with certain agencies, we won't poach from the agency per se, or we won't proactively sort of source, right?
Yes.
Recruit if somebody applies. That's a different story. But yeah, I would say, in terms of the competition, like we're, again, like really fortunate. I think our voluntary attrition rate last year was like less than 3%. And some of that could be chalked up to the market, right? And just not a ton of opportunity, unfortunately. But yeah, more times than not, when we see folks who voluntarily transition out, it's to take on an expanded scope or people, right? And so we are relatively lean, relatively flat internally. And so if somebody's in IC and want to eventually ascend into a people leadership role or an executive level role, like sometimes those opportunities are few and far between here. And so then we'll, more times than not encourage that person to pursue those externally where there might be an opportunity. But yeah, I would say it depends, all depends on the individual. And I would say from a competitive standpoint, the function, so you probably Netflix too, is like sometimes half of the roles that I'm working on will be entirely focused on the entertainment space and then studios, networks, right? And then sometimes it'll be entirely focused on, consumer tech and you get, the metas and the Googles and the snaps and, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of thrown a wrinkle in that. But yeah.
Okay. And last thing, I'm sure you get asked this a lot, but if somebody wants to have a good strategy for getting noticed in a pile of 1,000 resumes from your team, what advice do you even give them? Are you all using AI to do weird stuff now too? I imagine the arms race on that front is interesting too.
To a certain extent, yeah, we can talk about AI. We can offline on that one. Well, our ATS does implement some AI to sort of filter, right, and match keywords and key terms and that sort of thing. But I think at the end of the day, right, like the sort of talent acquisition and hiring piece, there's a very sort of human element to it, right, in terms of the evaluation. And so I think there's a lot of judgment that's still involved there as well. So it certainly helps, I would say. And I think, from a resume perspective, the more, curated somebody can be in terms of, in other words, on the back end, right? So the ATS basically takes the job description that we'll put together and we'll pull sort of key terms, right? And so if that's the job that you're interested in, it can't hurt, right, to sort of structure and frame your resume so that it matches in the event it can sort of bubble up. But I think beyond that, right, like there's, from a candidate perspective, what I see sometimes really position folks well to stand out is to, as best they can, don't kill me for this one, like do some of that networking upstream to really sort of understand the business and where this role might sit, if that makes sense, right? And so if you think about sort of the mass of applicants that might sit for X or Y or Z role, as best we can, like we want to get to everyone and evaluate everyone. But I would say the more sort of research and sort of direct outreach you can do ahead of time, let's say it's a role that sits within like our film title marketing group. You can quick I shouldn't say quite Google search, right? But you can do some upstream research to understand who heads film marketing, like how does our film marketing team break down? And then from there, whether it's LinkedIn or using some of the tools that are out there, right? Just send some outbound communication to folks that you think might be involved just to sort of put your name on the radar. I think, sometimes there's an apprehension there from candidates, I think for fear of being a bit too direct or overt in terms of their outreach. But I think more times than not, you see that.
Like it, yeah.
Because what ends up happening there, if you're maybe not the hiring manager, but you're within that same group and somebody reaches out to you, you're probably going to send that person's information to the recruiter, right? And then you've got
just in case, yeah.
From there.
Yeah.
So I know like it's not everybody is able to do that, right? Or can sort of figure out the right path there. But I think that the more sort of strategic you can be in terms of getting your name to the right folks and sort of getting out exposure, the better you can position yourself.
All right, last thing, in the Netflix office, more excitement for final run of Squid Game or final run of Stranger Things?
Stranger Things.
Okay. When does that come out again? July?
I don't know if I can tell you that.
Breaking news.
I'm joking. I think it's going to be around Thanksgiving.
Sometime in Q4. You got to win the quarter. Yeah.
Closing it out. Yeah, Dave, I think so. It's Squid, and then Wednesday is sort of in between, and then Stranger is at the end. So so I would say lots of excitement there, and I think in my world too, the sort of we don't use the franchise term at Netflix, but like that's been the first one and the biggest one. Closing it out this year with the same teens, and Hawkins. So
yeah. Of course, they're probably 28 years old now, but we'll try to do some de-aging on the post.
Man, it's in post.
Nice, cool. All right, man. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on, everyone. Any place you get your podcast, you can find the At This Time podcast. Episode 6, we're cranking away. You can see us in stunning 4K, all the places, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Check them out. Until next time, we'll catch you soon.